If I'd had to place a bet on where the phrase "thumb up the arse" would have come from today, I don't think it would have been rage arse. So, thanks. Yeah, that's not an offer, by the way. I need the clicker. Get me to the clicker.
I don't think I've ever been at a more Scottish conference, ever.
I would have placed a bet on a fifer, to be fair.
Yeah.
Hello, and thank you very much for having us today. I think it's an incredibly exciting time in Scottish news and politics, and telling those stories is all about credibility and authority. So it's brilliant to see Radio Centre's own research showing that radio remains the most trusted source of news at 77%, and that's compared to just 23% who would say that they trust social media. Global produces more than 5,000 bulletins a week across 13 newsrooms, and that's about 70 an hour over 8 brands and sub-brands, not all of which take news. So of Global's 26.3 million weekly reach, news has a reach of 24.8 million. So the Scotland News team is producing about 257 of those across our Heart, Smooth and Capital brands, and that's just part of how we're reaching audiences with the content that really matters to them. So everything our desk editors and our reporters are doing is taking into account that balance of what do we need to do regionally to super serve our audiences locally, and what are our national stations going to want from us. So that means our bulletins and reporting team are constantly looking at how we frame those stories for Heart, Capital and Smooth, and then how we take that and how much assumed knowledge we can build in, how much additional context we need to provide and backstory when we are sharing and telling those stories on our national brands. So that could be a Scottish perspective on a story that affects everybody, your strikes, your cost of living crisis, COVID. It could be a story that's just in the mix in that broader storytelling of news on a national level. Or it could be, those big set piece stories that are going to lead the agenda right across the UK. And politics is really a big hitter when it comes to that. And Gina, I'm going to let her get a word in edgeways, is LBC's Scotland political editor, joined us from The Scotsman in late 2021 after a career spent predominantly, though not exclusively, in print journalism. So, Gina, from your perspective, what are those differences working in radio to working in print, and what unique opportunities does radio bring?
Yeah, as Corrie says, print journalism has been something I've always worked in, and there are people here who I've interviewed in the past for various newspapers that I've worked in. And radio was not something I ever really thought about getting involved in, because when I was studying journalism back in the olden days, as we were describing them, you had to cut up bits of tape and stick them back together, and that just wasn't for me. So it's not an avenue that I ever went down, but hospital radio, and that was it. Did a bit of TV for a while, if anybody ever remembers Edinburgh Live, the cable television that was around back in the late 90s. Anyway, but newspapers have been the mainstay, and this suggestion to join Global, to join LBC, kind of came out of the blue. But at a time for me, I think, which was a great one because I wanted to do something different. And it'd been COVID and I'd been stuck at home, churning out thousands of words every day for The Scotsman. And this was a way of almost kind of getting back into the real world and having to turn up at places with a microphone in hand, learn new things, new skills, technology, how to edit, put packages together. It's been an absolute whirlwind this last year or so, and there have been many, many mistakes, many things not recorded that should have been, and the embarrassment that causes. But it has been absolutely fantastic. And I think, for me, the immediacy of radio has been the biggest impact. You're there at the scene of whatever it is, Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, First Minister's questions, whatever it might be, and you're telling people immediately what's happened, rather than having to sit down and churn out some words before it gets on a website and so on. And that's been phenomenal. It's been great to be part of the global team. LBC News, of course, the Rolling Station channel is where most of the content that I produce is heard. So as well as packages, there's also analysis and going on and trying to pretend that I know what I'm talking about most of the time. And the unique opportunities it really brings, and this has been fascinating to me as somebody who's always worked in print, is how many people want to be on the radio, and also because we film everything for social media as well, they want to be in front of the camera. Your access to politicians in particular is far more than it was as a print journalist, who they feel that they can generally ignore or talk to whenever they choose to, or just send a press release to, and that's what you have to put up with. But for radio, they want to be on radio, and I think it's because they understand, and these statistics that we've heard today, which are new to me, are quite phenomenal, and I think there is a general understanding of that out there. In fact, I was having a conversation. So Keir Starmer was up last week in Scotland, and we were initially told that commercial radio would get to speak to him, and then when we arrived, it was like, oh no, that's not happening. But luckily, that was his London team that were saying that. But luckily, having worked on the Scottish Labour media office quite hard myself, and Alan from Bauer, they understand the benefits of getting that message. It's like an advert, isn't it? Getting that message out on those bulletins. Yeah. Every hour throughout the day, different clips, different messages that you might want to see. And so we got that interview, and we got those in separate interviews, not a huddle, not the same thing. Yeah. And it's building that recognition, I think, with politicians, which has been very interesting, a learning curve for me and also for them, but I think they do understand it, and it's great to get that access.
And LBC News, I think, has been a massive game changer in that, the UK's first rolling news station really getting stuck into those stories, and I think, whether it's the COVID briefings being taken live the moment the UK government stepped in to block the GRR, gender recognition reform legislation, or Nicola Sturgeon's resignation press conference, being able to really grasp that and show just how important radio is. So some of the most significant stories we have told recently are, of course, the death of the Queen, when Scotland was absolutely the epicentre of that story, where she passed away at Balmoral. And it's, the ultimate bogeyman story. Any journalist will tell you, we've been sitting waiting our entire careers, not with bated breath, but waiting for this story to happen. The ultimate caveat of any festive break. You think you're having time off, but if the Queen dies, it's always been that way. Also, Scottish Government's gender recognition reform legislation, as we mentioned, and Nicola Sturgeon's resignation announcement. So let's just hear how some of that content has led the UK agenda.
And one of the places her father, the King, enjoyed most was Balmoral up in Scotland, where we can now cross to LBC's Jack Foster.
Andrew, the rain is coming and going still here at Balmoral, and there is a very obvious sadness, a hushed atmosphere outside the gates as darkness begins to descend outside this estate, which we know was so very important to the Queen throughout 96 years. A notice was put up here announcing the incredibly sad news of Her Majesty's death here today. We understand that the Princess Royal was by her mother's side during those final hours, as were the Duke and Duchess of Rothesay, now King and Queen
Previous
Consort.
lines in states, they always attract a significant number of people.
I think we're now seeing the first scenes of the cars and the hearse. Alan, over to you.
David, there before us is the hearse carrying Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. I can see it coming out of the castle grounds where she spent the final moments of her extraordinary 96-year life and 70-year reign over our United Kingdom. As the cortege begins to make its way past us here, we can see the oak coffin draped in the royal standard with a wreath on top. We can see it for the first time. As I said, it was carried by 6 of the gamekeepers here, as is tradition. Around me, dozens now bowing their heads in silence. And while the eyes and ears of the world are on this pocket of rural Aberdeenshire just now, it feels like everybody around me is almost reflecting on an intimate personal loss. Heads bowed, I can see some now actually with tears in their eyes.
It's 6 o'clock. Here's the latest.
From Global's newsroom, I'm Jack Foster.
The Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill is passed.
After 3 days of debate and years of controversy, the Scottish Parliament votes to back the controversial gender reform bill. Divisions were on show until the bitter end, though, with heckles from the public gallery, and one woman even flashed MSPs straight after the results of the vote.
The next, we will suspend business.
It's time now on LBC News to cross live to the Commons to hear from Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary. You're listening to LBC News.
Mr. Speaker, today I will make an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998, preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent.
This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 10 o'clock. In the last few minutes, it's been announced Nicola Sturgeon will resign as Scotland's First Minister. The SNP leader is due to give a press conference.
Let's hear a little more of what she said and talk it through as well with Gina Davidson, LBC Scotland political editor. Did anyone see this coming, Gina?
No, I think is the short answer to that question, Sheila. I mean, there have been questions about just how long Nicola Sturgeon would go on for as First Minister and as leader of her party, really since the last Holyrood elections, because it was quite a feat winning again. It was quite a feat passing that longest-serving First Minister mark. So those questions, of course, were bound to arise. How long do you go on for?
This is LBC.
Now, just a bit of context on the Queen there. After the BBC commercial radio was first with boots on the ground, Global was broadcasting rolling news content, live reporter hits before Her Majesty passed away, and we were able to break that news immediately and then maintain coverage from Scotland over what was an incredibly intense 12-day period with a team of 8. Now, Bauer, I believe, are sitting just above the 20 mark for news across its Scottish stations. So that extraordinary story that really had Scotland at the centre of it was carried and told by the two biggest operators in commercial radio by around 25 people, sub 30 people. And that is compared to a cast of literally, and I checked, hundreds at BBC Radio Scotland. So just looking at the GRR debate, Gina, gender recognition reform, how's that gone from a story where, we're kind of banging on London's door saying, look, you should be talking about this is going to be huge, to something that they are regularly leading with?
Yeah, and can I just say I'm still not used to hearing my voice at all. I can't bear it. I don't know how it works in this industry. But anyway, yes, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill has really been quite fascinating. It's a story that I've been following for a number of years now, prior to coming into radio, because it struck me as a piece of legislation that was really creating quite a shift in society, and there was bound to be ructions. There were going to be people who were not happy with it, and so that transpired, and we saw those protests begin to develop. We saw new grassroots women's organisations set themselves up to campaign against it, and so the story itself, just grew and grew and grew, and obviously initially it just felt like a very Scottish story, something that's happening in the Parliament, and maybe wasn't particularly something that would be of interest to a UK listening audience. But ultimately, as you heard there with Alistair Jack blocking that bill, what we saw with that piece of legislation is to my mind, something that shows how devolution itself is developed. It's still quite a young thing, devolution, even although we're all now used to having the Scottish Parliament and First Ministers and so on. It's only just over 20 years that it's been in existence. So all of these new challenges that it's facing are fascinating on a political level, and that relationship between the UK government and the Scottish government. And of course, anything that Nicola Sturgeon puts her name to, I think it's fair to say, is of interest to a wider audience, because everything has a constitutional element and everything leads to... Speaking of,
but that her resignation, why do you think that had such a massive impact? I don't think it would be the same if it was Mark Drakeford.
That's true, but I think that's because Wales haven't had a referendum. Wales haven't had figures, even like Alex Salmond on the stage. Wales haven't had, a fight between the two biggest figures in the nationalist movement of Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond over everything that happened since he was First Minister as well. So I think the personalities of those politicians are bigger and on a bigger stage than maybe Mark Drakeford, not to do him down in any sense, but and also Wales, the Parliament there doesn't have the same powers. It doesn't have the same ability to affect change in the way that the Scottish Parliament does. So there is, and also because we have an SNP government, a nationalist government who are constantly pushing at those boundaries of devolution because ultimately they want independence, what you have is fight after fight after fight. It's just the way that the Constitution is set up. And at the minute you have a UK government as well who's quite happy to have that fight. So you have these clashes, which I think is always of interest. If it's a row, there's people are going to be interested.
Now, I'm reliably informed by the screen at the front that our time's up, so I think we're going to have to skip past some stuff. But I think the interest in, for example, the SNP leadership campaign has had. That's a completely different ballgame than that would have been 3, 4, 5 years ago. We've got hustings, LBC hustings, coming from our Glasgow Broadcast Centre on Monday evening, hosted by Ian Dale. It'll be live on LBC, and that just feels like a completely and utterly different level of involvement than we would have had before. So tune in. I think, what is really important and stands out to me is that the London centricism that has always existed, it might still be there to a degree, but it is absolutely changing. And Scottish news is so often absolutely front and centre with that. And, Gina's role at Holyrood is a direct result of that. And I think, when we look at the bang for its buck that commercial radio provides, it's just massive. It's about representation and it matters. We super serve our audiences in Scotland, but they rightly should feel that they can go to our national stations and feel represented and part of that experience there. So in the most recent radar, BBC Radio Scotland were sitting at 780,000 weekly reach. Global Scottish stations sitting at 859,000. And commercial radio in total right across Scotland is reaching almost 3.3 million listeners every week. And for the first time in the most recent radar, more than half of LBC's 3.1 million listeners on the LBC brand came from outside London. And I think that really demonstrates that this more inclusive, geographically, culturally inclusive approach is bringing in more listeners, more diverse listeners from new marketplaces into that national space. And now, more than ever before, they'll be greeted by a Scottish voice. Thanks.